I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's about 1 o'clock and got some stuff to go through. We're going to do a group activity today, or actually a couple. So for an introduction, personally or career-wise, that's up on the screen if you can see that, but I want to tell you a little about me personally. I enjoy playing guitar. I repair and also build them, but mostly from kits. I haven't done my own carve yet. I like baking breads and desserts, and that has turned my kids into snobs, because when they ask for dessert, they ask for creme brulee. And I like building Lego sets with them. And about 9 months ago, I started powerlifting as another hobby to have. So something I want to do in this class is keep it interactive and keep you all engaged and with each other. So the first thing I'm going to ask you all to do is to introduce yourselves to me, all at once. I'm just kidding. That'd be some cacophony. But what I think would be fun is if I could get you all to stand up. Go ahead, stand up. Find someone close to you and raise your right hand. Go ahead. And now turn to that person, give them a big high five, tell them your name, tell them about a favorite hobby or favorite food, and if you don't have any of those, I'm sorry, maybe tell them your favorite swear word. All right, so we're going to have a few more interactions like that throughout the session. They won't all involve your favorite swear word, but sometimes you feel like you need to get that out, so go ahead. But what I want to do today is talk about UX and usability, where usability fits within the practice of user experience design. So when you hear me say UX, I'm talking about user experience. And how we can apply the usability practices within the AV industry and with what you do every day. So there are a lot of things, and this is a quick disclaimer, that a lot of things that contribute to the overall user experience of using a space or a system, stuff like lights, temperature of the room, the acoustics, stuff that maybe you don't have any control over sometimes. But a lot of those topics are being explored in other sessions, and today we're going to focus on AV interfaces, or typically what I refer to as GUIs, or graphical user interfaces. So let's see. One thing that's going to be a little ambitious that we're going to take on today is we're going to run a live usability test. You're all going to work on that in groups. We don't need any of those screenshots yet. You can put those back. But we're going to eventually go up and take some of those and work in groups and do a usability test. We're going to take a look at those results from that usability test and other usability tests and see how those results ultimately can improve the things you're working on. And we'll learn how doing some of those things will help you retain business or differentiate yourselves. So I put this slide in here because it's one of my favorite quotes and kind of wraps up how I feel about most things. And basically what Lord Kelvin is trying to say is that if you can't measure something, you don't know much about it and you can't improve it. So to understand a little bit about usability, we're going to talk about user experience design, or UX, as a practice. And if we think about this Venn diagram, we can see usability engineering as one of the circles. That's only one small portion of the user experience. We're going to discuss it, how it's defined, how it's measured in a little bit. But first I want to talk about something tangentially related, and that's information architecture. So this is a very simple concept map or hierarchy. And on it, it contains a subject you can think about and all of the related subjects and related functions and properties of those objects. So when you look at this hierarchy, it's easy to see what functions and properties belong to each animal. And there's a myth that rolls into that about that a user should be able to get anything they need within 3 clicks. And I want to talk a little bit first about why that might be a myth. So on the screen, we've got what's called a broad hierarchy. And this is a mental model that you might create when thinking about or trying to put your ideas together about an interface. You may be able to perform any single task within 3 clicks, going 1, 2, 3 deep. But consider how that GUI might look. Imagine that top node is your press to begin button, or whatever automates your system. And so you press that, the next page you might be presented with this. So I've highlighted 8 of those buttons because in that broad hierarchy example, which is shown also on the right, we have 8 different options. And so we've got 8 different buttons on this graphical user interface. There might be a lot of mental processing involved in trying to figure out, do I need a source? Am I looking to perform an action? Am I looking to get a function out of something else, a property? And so trying to figure out what your next step is might take a little bit of time. Now, the example on the right in this screen is a narrower hierarchy. And this could lead to a situation where it maybe doesn't take so long to navigate through, but what you end up having is you get so far deep, or a user gets so far deep that they don't know how to get back to where they were in case they did make a mistake. And part of this is because people don't always read what they see on a screen. They skim. And there are 2 reasons why people skim screens or interfaces. And the first is mental, because over the past 30 years of using screens as what we tend to work on, we expect content to be chunked in certain ways, to be grouped up so that we can skim around, find what we need, and then focus in on the details. And so the next thing that contributes to why people skim is physical. And on screens like these, screens like your computer monitors or even touch panels, the light is emitted out at your eyes, and that's fatiguing. So the statistic is that people tend to read about 25% slower, so that contributes to why people skim when looking at a screen. So this concept map is something I put together from the various functions and properties on a touch panel. And what we have here is what's called a polyhierarchy, or if you don't like big words, like a web structure. And I should mention, if you have any questions, just feel free to raise your hand or shout it out. I've got this catch box I can throw at your face. I don't think it hurts too much. So anyhow, trying to piece together in your mind this concept map of how this whole system is supposed to work might be a little bit difficult. And so that's why it's so important to do some actual testing and find out what works best for each client that you have. So that myth about a user should be able to get anywhere they need within 3 clicks likely came about because it's easy to test clicks. But the problem is that correlates clicks to how much mental processing the user has to go through to find where they're going, and really doesn't have anything to do with how much time things take. I was reading User Experience Professionals Association's magazine, and I came upon this article by someone in the AV industry already, and her job is in user experience design. And it really struck me as ringing true to me. And what she's trying to say is that on the web, you get frustrated, you find another site to do what you wanted to do. But if I get up here on stage and I can't figure out how to get my slides on, or we can't get the microphone working, or there's feedback or whatever, you are forced to continue on and try and figure it out, and you risk embarrassment. And so what happens, I watched this video on what happens to the body when you get embarrassed, and what ends up happening is your blood vessels dilate, adrenaline starts to go through you, and these are the same things that happen when you're in danger. You revert back to those fight or flight reflexes. And I thought more about it, and well, in long term, that can erode confidence and self-esteem. And I thought more about it, and I thought that this isn't the sort of experience that I want anyone using the things that I designed to have. So we're going to quickly go through the basics of usability and usability testing. What I am going to ask that you do is, we've got some, I would call them polls, but there are two things I want you all to go back to your jobs or back to your homes with when we finish. And those are two ways that you can easily do some usability testing and measurement that you can take back and work with every day. So the first one is going to be what's called a heuristic evaluation. Has anyone ever heard the term heuristic? I had to look it up to know what it means. So, okay, yeah. It's a quality of something that makes it evident that the user can learn it by themselves. So Jacob Nielsen published his 10 usability heuristics back in 1995. So there's nothing incredibly new here. But I think we all need a way to kind of measure against these things. So we're going to create a heuristic evaluation together. And to do that, I need your help. I'm going to occasionally put up a slide, and I'm going to ask you to rate something. And to do that, we need to go on our mobile devices, laptop, whatever you brought. There's free Wi-Fi here. It's vevox.app, I think. It's vevox.app, or I bet .com probably redirects there. But I'll let you get that up. But sure, VVOX, that's Victor, Echo, Victor, O, I don't know what the aeronautical code, what is it? Oscar, X-ray.com. Thank you. So if anyone's ever done like a Google search about usability, you've probably run across the name Jacob Nielsen. And Jacob Nielsen is one of the founding pioneers of user experience and usability work. Right now he's with Nielsen Norman Group, Norman of Don Norman, and he's published such great books as Design of Everyday Things, which if you haven't read, I recommend to absolutely everybody, no matter what your role is. It's an incredible book. So we're going to discuss these 10 heuristics and how they can be applied to AV interfaces. So let's see. Sure. Well, we're not quite to the point where we're going to rate things yet. Okay, yeah, I don't have a poll up yet. I'm going to launch it in a minute. So the first of these heuristics is visibility of system state. And while it may seem innocuous, you can see that being done on the screen. And it might be innocuous. However, you can imagine if a user walks into a room and they start their presentation, they're moving about, they're going on, and they accidentally bump into that touch panel with their bare elbow, and all of a sudden the screen goes up, the projector lift starts being stowed, the sound goes down, the lights go up, and they may not know what's going on for the first few minutes or seconds. You could logically deduce, of course, that the system is shutting down, but having this little reminder there is a great way to remove one of those pain points when using a system. So what I'd like you to do, we're going to go ahead and do the first rate poll, and I'm going to launch it in a second. And what I'd like you to do is rate the visibility of the interface on the screen based on the following context. Is the system on-off status, is that visible? Is there the ability to route sources to destinations, is that visible? And is the ability to change the camera view visible? And so we'll wait for a minute and let all of you gather that data. Sorry, it's 155, and then the rest of it is correct. And this is just, however you feel about it. If, we're not all experts here, but we're going to use the conglomeration of everyone here to create this evaluation together. All right, we'll just wait another second or two. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Oh, we got a few more coming in. All right, and we'll move on. And at the end of this, I'm going to bring all the results up so we can see, how that looks. So let's see. The second heuristic is a match between system and real world. And so in Nielsen's own words, the system should speak the user's language with words, phrases, and concepts familiar to the user rather than system-oriented terms, follow real-world conventions, and make information appear in a natural and logical order. So this is one. Go ahead.
You have number one?
Yeah, I'm going to bring them all up after we're done. Did you still need to rate it, or you want to?
Do we have heuristic number one? Because heuristic number two.
Yeah, the last one was visibility of system state. So with match between system and you want me to take it back to look at it? Okay, all right. This is an easy one that we seem to mess up all the time, and I'm including myself in there because I like to use acronyms and technical terms just as much as everyone else at this show. Or case example on the screen, we sometimes use product names. So I want to mention this button that says Capture HD in the upper left, and that is a specific product that a manufacturer used to sell, might still sell. But does anyone think that most users, end user, knows what that product is? That they could refer to it by name? So they see that button, and they're likely to first think, well, I'm glad I'm being captured in HD, but what about 4K? Or how do I record my lecture? So the term and the icon don't seem to provide this great match between system and the real world. And if we look at the Start Recording button, we can see that there's a camera icon. And that would lend a user then to think, okay, well, is it recording from the camera? And what's the camera view? Is it getting me? Is it getting my slides? But really just all I need are my slides. So in the case where they're doing some sort of windowed setup with camera and slides, forgoing the icon altogether might be the best option for matching system to the real world. So we're going to do another one. Again, I apologize for that number on the screen being incorrect. It's 155, but likely you're already in and don't need to repunch that number in. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that poll up. And should be open now. We'll take a few minutes to rate this interface on the screen for a match between system and real world with the following context in mind. Does switching back and forth between instruction and active learning match the real world? And what I mean by active learning is like team-based learning where people are working in groups, maybe on their own display. Does changing the lighting on the system match what you would expect to see in the real world? And does showing the same content on multiple displays in the system match the real world? All right, we're at about 70% of all of you. Take it for another moment. And we'll move on. All right. So the third heuristic is user control and freedom. And it's all about letting the user choose their own adventure and letting them get out of proverbial jail. So this might, again, seem like it's not a big deal, but this is a good example of giving users an emergency exit. And I probably don't even need to mention it, as most of the interfaces I see anymore contain a button like this. But just try and do your best to allow users to navigate through all the pages without hindrance. Don't put things in their way, and give them a way to get back quickly. We're going to do another poll. Yes?
Question is, today's world, people know what home means, but main page may not be the best solution.
Sure.
In this particular case.
Yeah. As we all get used to the conventions used on our phones and our devices, using different language may be appropriate. So in a little bit, we're going to do a usability test, and one of the things you should be keeping an eye on is language and what terms you use. And that goes back to visibility, the first heuristic. So the poll is open. We'll wait a couple more minutes. And then we'll move on to the fourth heuristic. So rate this interface on the screen for user freedom with the following context in mind. Does it give an emergency exit? Does it allow users to go back to the main page or home page? Does it let users move between pages and functions, or does it seem to do that without hindrance? Again, we're just trying to rate it as we see it. The blue circle in the upper left? That's the logo. I just wanted to cover it up. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this and then move on to the next one. All right, so heuristic number 4 is about making sure we don't break the conventions and systems that we've introduced into our interfaces. So this example shows 2 different pages from the same system and in the same building, and there's a button in the upper right for each of them. And this is a great way to confuse users, because you can imagine what might happen is if they're used to the button in the upper right always being go back to the main page or the home page, they might accidentally get to the page on the upper left, and when they do that, they say, oh, I didn't want to get to this page, and they try and hit that button, but all of a sudden now they're turning the system off. So when you set up interface elements on a screen, you're creating systems and you're chunking. Always try and follow the conventions and systems that you have started to create, even if you've created them by default. So we're going to do one more. And then we're going to get to heuristic number 5. I'm going to open up this poll. But go ahead and rate this interface for consistency of layout of buttons with the following context in mind. Does the placement of visual elements on the screen provide consistency? Does the language used seem to be consistent? Is it standardized in end users' terms? Does the button and icon design look to be consistent between all 3 of the pages that you see? I know it's a little small. All right, I think we're just about done. Perfect. So after this heuristic, we're going to get up and do a quick little exercise to get you moving around, and then we'll come back to the rest of them. But anyone ever heard the phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure? Jacob Nielsen twists that to kind of say that even better than good error messages is a careful design which prevents a problem from occurring in the first place. Either eliminate error-prone conditions or check for them and present users with a confirmation option before they commit to that action. And so this is an interesting one because there are 2 types of user errors. There are slips and there are mistakes. A slip is when a user intends to do one thing but ends up doing another by accident. So on this page, with limited real estate and a lot of buttons on the top, that button might be very small. And so they may intend to hit the document camera and instead accidentally hit the disk up below it. A mistake, as opposed to a slip, is where a user has a goal which is inappropriate for the current task. So in this case, that might be if the user doesn't understand the icons and they want to turn the volume up and they start hitting the button that shows a speaker with sound coming out of it. But they hit the one on the bottom. No matter how many times they press it and they think that they're right, the volume will never go up. So that's a mistake. And mistakes are important to look at because they allow us to go back and figure out where we misled them. To solve this in this case, you could put a plus and a minus next to the speaker icon rather than the sound coming out. That clears up what you see there. So we're going to go ahead and do another one, and then we'll take a quick break and do an exercise. Again, that code is 155, not 150, and we'll get that started. Go ahead and rate the interface on the screen for error prevention. Does it keep people from making an error with automatic camera selection? All right, we'll go ahead and close that poll. And I think I'm going to put it to all of you. Would you like to get up and do a quick activity, or do you want me to keep going? Keep going? All right, we'll do an activity in a little bit then, or we'll skip it. All right, so the sixth heuristic is recognition over recall. And these terms come from psychology. Recognition is the ability to immediately recognize something as familiar, whereas recall means you're searching through your memory banks trying to remember something. So I'm going to ask what these icons that are on the screen mean, because they've been on the past several slides on the interfaces we've been looking at. And if you find yourself pausing and trying to remember back, that's because these icons aren't necessarily recognizable. You're thinking back to those previous slides. What did they mean in that context? So there are three things that can convert recall into recognition, which is what we want to promote, but you only have control over one of them. So the first thing that can help promote recognition or convert recall into recognition is practice. How often does a user press a particular button, or do they have to perform a specific task? The other is recency. When was the last time that they did it? You have no control over how often people use your systems or your interfaces. You have no control over when they do it. But the thing you do have control over is context. What other functions and items are associated with what the user is doing in that very moment in time when they're using your design? So if you show the user a picture of a projector in a room where there's an option to project something, you have now given them context for what they're about to do. If later on you decide to change that room and you change it to a flat panel display and get rid of the projector, you just change the programming but not the user interface, now you're asking users to recall what that button used to do and then think about how it's going to work in the current context. So these are just 5 quick things you can do, and these slides will all be available. Some of them I'm just going to kind of go through and not read everything that's on the screen, but you can download this and get these 5 things that you can do. Don't use gestures. They require users to recall what those gestures are supposed to do. So one time I saw a touch panel use a pinch gesture to reduce the volume, which is a very clever thing to do, but that doesn't map well with bringing the volume down. Label any and all icons whenever possible. Sometimes it's not always clear what an icon does. Provide good visual cues. Chunk things in ways that make sense to the users. And don't rely solely on the training session, the one training session that they get at the end of a project, and give users appropriate context for the things that they're about to do in the system that they're using. If the only microphone in the system is a lapel, don't show a picture of a ceiling microphone. So we're going to go ahead and do another one of these. And I'll go ahead and start that poll. Go ahead and rate this interface shown on the screen for recognition over recall of what each button does versus having to recall that. So if you are able to immediately recognize what every button does, then you're giving it a good rating. If you have to think about or recall what it might do, then it's toward the lower end of the scale. And ultimately, what we're going to do with this, with all these ratings, we're going to provide a report or just a chart so we can visually see what sort of things we need to do a better job with and where we can go back and improve. All right, so what Nielsen has to say about flexibility and efficiency of use is that accelerators, unseen by the novice user, may often speed up the interaction for the expert user, such that the system can cater to both the inexperienced and experienced users alike. And this screenshot is a pretty good example, of where that's being done pretty well. A novice user can come in and just kind of throw up any sort of source they want in whatever order it comes up on the screen. But that might not be good enough for an expert user. They particularly want to put one piece of data in the upper left-hand quadrant and another piece of data in the lower right. So they're able to do that just by pressing the advanced control. But all of the buttons that come up with that aren't seen by the novice user when they first come up. So we're going to go ahead and rate another one for flexibility and efficiency of use. With the following context in mind. Can the user tailor the use of the interface? Does it look like they can do that? How efficient does this interface seem to be for users? We'll give it another couple of minutes. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this and move on. All right, so this is always one that I come to and think it's something that we should know inherently, but it's worth repeating and pointing out because I actually still see it sometimes. And I think the main reason is because we tend to get too many cooks in the kitchen when it comes to GUIs. Everybody kind of leaves their mark on what they see in the room, so they want to have some sort of input. And despite everything else on this particular screen, the thing that jumps out to me is the use of the subheading entertain. We can see from the button above that's in blue, that's highlighted in blue with blue entertainment, which doesn't even fit in the button on one line. That we're already in entertainment. We don't need, with every single channel, we don't need another label to tell us that we're in entertain. The background image also competes with the rest of the visual elements on the screen. So we're going to do another quick poll, and thanks everyone for playing along. I hope that when we're done with this, you can take this back to work with you and start doing this with some of the interfaces that you see, and provide quick feedback to whoever has made them or yourself that, here's where we need more work. That's the idea behind this. Rate this interface for aesthetic and minimalist design with the following context in mind. Are there any visual elements visible that seem unnecessary, or is there any text or dialogue that may be unnecessary? All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that. So with heuristic number 9, which is help users recognize, diagnose, and recover, I'll point out that don't feel bad if you've ever committed any of these errors or didn't understand about these heuristics, because even the largest companies make the same mistakes, and they have budgets much larger and staff sizes much larger than we even have at this show. Microsoft had this gem when Windows 10 came out. And it, as you can see, something has happened, but it doesn't help users recognize, diagnose, or even recover. Something happened, close. So I think the last I heard was Microsoft had over 120,000 employees, and I think there's somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people here at the show. Anyone familiar with Logitech Harmony remotes, the home home remotes, there's this help button on the Logitech Harmony remotes that guides the user through a troubleshooting process when something doesn't go wrong. And it basically asks a bunch of questions. Is the TV on? Is your receiver set to HDMI 1 or video 1? I've seen a lot of touch panels with help buttons, but typically those help buttons are used to contact someone in tech support, get them over to the room, or even provide two-way communication so that they can help the users diagnose and troubleshoot. And so, our systems can be pretty complex, so it's not a bad idea to keep users out of the troubleshooting process. But any way you can speed up that, those moments of tension when they're using something and it isn't working properly is a way to make a customer a bit more appreciative, and appreciative customers are return customers. So we're gonna go ahead and do another poll, and we only have two more. This one and one more. Please rate this interface for helping users recognize, diagnose, and recover from any error. And give it another minute. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. The last heuristic is help and documentation. And there's something that really struck me about this particular help manual. Everything is grouped into chunks: before using the product, while using, after using, how to recharge it. And it provides pictures that indicate the correct state for each one of those steps. A lot of times I've seen binders full of spec sheets passed off to users as this is the system manual. And if I come up to a system, and I'm a consultant, I'm a designer, if I walk up to a system and someone hands me that as the manual, I'm probably just gonna throw up my hands and call tech support as well. And I like technology. We should be attempting to create something for users specifically that's 1-2 pages that guides them through using the system. Something that can be read quickly and by the people that actually use that system. So it might be necessary to hand over that binder of 500 pages of spec sheets, but I think a little extra document to kind of guide users through would be very helpful. So we're going to do one last poll and then an exercise. Go ahead and rate this interface for providing help and documentation. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that. All right. So now what I'm going to do, once you have all these ratings, you can provide some sort of report if that's necessary in your role, or you can just kind of review the data to understand where it is that you can increase the usability of some of your designs through each heuristic. So I've gone ahead and downloaded this is the report, and I better pull this back over to the other side so I can see the tabs. Here we are. So one thing you can do is use this data then, average out what everyone has done, what every person has rated each individual heuristic, and provide that on a report that outlines here are our ratings for our heuristics. We've been doing a great job on matching system to real world, but maybe not such a great job on aesthetic and minimalist design. And so something you can add to this chart or this evaluation or any quotes you can get from people while you're doing this evaluation. If aesthetic and minimalist design is something that you aren't doing well in, go back and find out why that person rated it that way, or write down why you think that you're not doing a great job with aesthetic and minimalist design. So I only throw this slide up there as something that you can download from the presentation, or just grab a quick pick of the 10 do's of usable system design from each heuristic. So let's see. A lot of times, our interactions with technology shape and guide our expectations, and that changes over time. So this means the things that you're doing today specifically may not work well 3 to 5 years down the line. But if you still adhere to these heuristics in your new designs, you should be on a right track to design usable systems. So we're going to do a group activity in groups of 3 in a minute. And that's going to be, you're going to run a usability test. And a usability test is a test run of a prototype system or interface used to answer a question or a set of questions. And to figure out what questions you want to ask, you have to find out what the user pain points are. So something like, it takes too much time to get set up and running translates to, is this interface going to be faster for users than what they're already using? A problem like, I don't know how to do X can translate to, can users find or perform this function? And always try and ask while you're doing these, what are the users feeling and doing while they're performing these tasks? And you have to probe that a little bit. You have to ask, were you comfortable doing that? What sort of, insights can you give me about that process? Keep things open-ended and try not to lead them. And that's a really tough thing to do. Prototypes themselves can be high fidelity. They can be in situation. You can actually take people into a room and use that room's system. Or you can do something like you see on the screen, something that I would call low fidelity prototype. And that's what we're going to do in a few minutes. We're going to use screenshots to do a usability test. So as a test designer, you specify the tasks that participants will perform. And those tasks will hopefully answer those questions that you have. So what we're attempting to do with usability testing is to optimize our interfaces in a specific way to meet user needs. So in a few moments, we'll be working in groups of 3 I mentioned. You'll each have a role, and I'll kind of describe those roles in a second. But you can decide in your groups which role you want to be. We're going to do a local moderated usability test. So just some terms that you can take back. Local means there is a moderator in the room. Moderated means there's someone kind of assigning tasks to a user or giving them their tasks. Having a moderator in the room while someone's doing a usability test is that way that you can ask people how they feel and understand their body language. Sometimes people may say, yeah, this seemed easy, but during the test, they might actually be making faces that indicate it wasn't so easy. So before we get started, I'm going to just give a little bit of advice. For the moderator, be casual, be relaxed. Give your participant their tasks, their scenario based off the room constraints, and I'll give those in a minute. Based off this script, and I have scripts for moderators up here. Don't attempt to take the test for them. We're not testing the participant, we're testing the interface. So whatever the user does or the participant does, that's what we want to find out. And they can do nothing wrong. It's only our interface that has failed when they get something wrong. So if the participant gets too far off track, it's also appropriate to start them back over from the beginning, or maybe start them from another page. You don't want your participants to get flustered. And if you don't know what the correct route or answer is, that's fine, because sometimes knowing that is just one more way we can lead participants to what we intend to find. And we don't want to do that because we want to see what happens naturally. As far as the participant, do your best to put yourselves in the shoes of an actual system user. You can use a writing utensil or just point and press. We're gonna have some sheets over there you can pick up. Point to the button or buttons, plural, that you think will accomplish the task that the moderator gives you. If you think it takes multiple button presses, press them in the order you think that you should go in, or whatever order comes naturally. And the one other role we have is a recorder. The recorder's job is to track what button is pressed, clicked, and in what order. And ideally, you'll want to keep your stopwatch handy. Everyone have like a stopwatch app on their mobile device or something else they can track time with? If you don't, maybe ask someone else in your group to be the recorder. So what you want to do is keep track of how much time elapses between button presses. And that way you can see how long the total task takes and how long each subtask, every button that they press, takes in between. So let's see. Ideally, you could video record yourselves doing a test, and that way you could go back later and find out how long things took, or remind yourselves of what sort of things you saw during the test. So this is the system that we're going to do a usability test. It's what I would call an active learning classroom, where you have teams set up around the room, each with their own display. You have 2 projectors up on the wall in front. Show of hands, and I think I already know the answer to this. How many people were confused? Yeah, okay. Let me ask another question. How many of you thought that was fun or could be fun? Okay, that's fair, that's fair. All right. The question that I usually get is, how many times do you need to do this? How many participants are necessary? And there's this misconception that the results of usability testing has to have some sort of statistical significance. But the truth is, there's a law of diminishing returns that happens when you start to test participants. You can't get new data, or it's harder to get new data after you've already gone through a certain number. And it turns out that you can solve about 85% of your usability problems after just testing with 5 users. Now, if you wanted to solve 95%, you'd have to test another 8. Now that's a big increase, testing 13 participants instead of 8. And that data is actually, it may look like a schematic chart or graph, but it's actually made up of numbers from thousands of usability tests that the Nielsen-Norman Group has performed over the last 30 years. So this seems to bear out what they're saying. And what they're trying to say is that when you test with 5 users, you solve 85% of the problems, or you understand 85% of the problems, and you can start to solve for them. But anyone else you test after that is just reinforcing, likely, what you already know from those first 5 users. So a better way to go about solving a few more usability issues would be to test 5 participants, go back, change what you need to change, and then test with another 5 participants. Now you've done 2 rounds of iteration. And that's usually where we find that we get the biggest increases in usability, is when we can run a couple of tests. So it's still kind of a generalization in the sense that there are types of tests that you do want to test a lot more users or participants. One example would be if you're doing eye tracking testing. That's the sort of thing where you're going to want a lot more than 5 participants, because what you're trying to test there is something quantitative. You're just trying to see data. Where are people looking? You're not necessarily trying to solve any sort of qualitative problem like, can they find this button? So this was a discount usability test. That's a technical term for what we just did, low fidelity prototyping. And it's a great way to help us optimize our minimum viable product. So there are a variety of metrics that we can gain from doing a usability test, such as success rate, how often the participants succeeded in the tasks that you gave them. You can rate task difficulty, which you did in this test. You can rate find out error rate, how many times they make a mistake or a slip, and even how many button presses they make. And each of these things tells us something different. So the two metrics I have on the screen are my go-to, and that's success rate and task difficulty. Because when you combine them, you get some pretty cool insights. With success rate, we want to try and hit 90%. That's indicative of a good design. Anywhere between 80 and 90, dig a little deeper on it. Like, we didn't do so well with task number 2. Why is that? You go back to your notes and you find out, oh, well, they hovered over this button. They may have thought it meant something else, or it wasn't in fact a button. Didn't look like a button. Anywhere between 70 and 80% is something where you need to figure out where you went wrong and start working on those problems. And then anything below 70% is kind of, that tells you need a whole new, like a whole redesign or overhaul of what the interface looks like. So, but when you use success rate and task difficulty together, you can determine if the users found the result by mistake or were misled. So in this particular example, less or just a little over 50% of people actually had success completing the tasks, but more than half considered it easy or very easy, and somewhere in the middle too. So that tells us they didn't succeed, but they thought it was easy. So that tells me that we led them somewhere, and it was not the right place. Here's a chart of some other results. We took the time on task, which is why I had you write down how long each task took. We broke that up into each button press, kind of like you did here. Can anyone tell me what they think that this chart means? I know it might be tough to read in some spots. Feel free to move around. Recognition, okay. I think what we determined from these results was that our design was learnable. And that's because we gave them a task. It took them a few seconds to identify what they wanted to do in the first button press. And as they went on, the time on task decreased each time. So the other thing we learned from this, aside from one case there, the other thing we learned from this, referring to that specific case, was that that data point moves up on the third subtask. We determined that was an outlier. And we figured out it was an outlier because we were able to go back, look at the recording, and say, well, they started on the wrong page from that second task. And then they just kept pressing a button that wasn't actually a button. So we addressed that button in a different way, or that label is really what it was. And it helped us understand that that first press is so important. So as a consultant, consulting designer, I see a lot of touch panel graphical user interfaces before they get installed and implemented. And as a GUI designer, I make a lot of assets for these GUIs. And I know it takes a lot of time to finalize and revise these designs once they're implemented. So these are just a couple of mock-up or wireframes that I put together using PowerPoint and Lucidchart. Lucidchart is kind of cool because you can design things to be a specific pixel area, just like, actually this one was set up to be 800 by 480, which is a very common resolution found in one of the large manufacturers' touch panels here at the show. And they don't need to look pretty. I know what I gave you was like a finished design with all the graphical user elements in their places and finished. But it doesn't need to be like that. You can test, just like that image we had where someone was using a paper iPad and kind of flipping through pages that way. I'd like to see more wireframes as a consultant come to me before I see a finished project or product, because I know how difficult it is to create this sort of thing, and chances are there are going to be some changes anyway. So one thing we used, this is a utility called Chalkmark, and Chalkmark is made by Optimal Workshop, so you can check out their website, optimalworkshop.com. They have 5 different utilities now for online web testing. So you don't have to do a local test like we just did. You can do a remote test. You can send screenshots, or you can upload screenshots to this utility, ask users to complete a task via prompt, and all they have to do is press whatever button they think is gonna complete the task. And what this utility does is generate a heat map for where users are pressing things. This took a total of 15 minutes to make the wireframes. It took another 30 minutes to create the test, and that included a quick test run that I went through with a couple participants to see if the test was designed flawed or anything that was gonna trip people up. And then I loaded my wireframes up to the website, sent a link out to my test participants. It took an average of 2 minutes per task per participant, so I think that's 6 minutes per participant. I sent an email out at 11 p.m., and by 5 p.m. the next day I had 10 participants that had completed the test. And the results can be really compelling in terms of what needs to be fixed right away and what can be shelved off to the side. So this can help you prioritize which way you're gonna head with your design. Adobe XD is another utility. I wanted to give you guys some tools that you could use. Some of them are free, some of them cost money. But they're great ways to just start mocking things up. Paper is always a great place to start. I like that. I happen to have a Microsoft Surface, so there's a whiteboard app, and that's usually where I start if I don't have any paper nearby. And then you don't have to use some of these custom utilities like Chalkmark or the tools made by Optimal Workshop. You can do a Skype meeting or a GoTo meeting with the participant, and kind of, if they turn their webcam on, you can see how they're reacting to the screens and what they're kind of focused on, and then ask them how they're doing too. Each test takes about, I think we spent about 15 minutes on that, and the results that you end up getting from them can give you a ton of data about what your users are seeing. So I know I'm finally getting to why this is important, but a colleague of mine works for a Fortune 500 chemicals company, and he forwarded this information to me about their usability and UX efforts. And this is just what they happened to gain by changing one page of what their internal employees had to deal with. Not all of us in this room work for a Fortune 500 company, but that doesn't mean that whatever you start to do, that these tests don't scale for you. How many of you, and this can be rhetorical, you can raise your hand if you agree, or we'll do this. If you agree with the statement, then we'll move on. But how many of you think you spend too much time supporting issues that could be easily solved by using a couple of the methods that we went through today? Okay. How many of you think you could save time for your organization or your clients' organizations? Any chance you could increase customer retention or differentiate yourselves in the market by doing some of these things? Yeah. So there are a lot of people in the industry that consider themselves futurists. They look at where we've been, they see a trend line, and they try to predict where we'll be in a few years. I don't like to do that. I'm a designer. I like to stay focused on the things that I like, which are making systems that are useful, usable, efficient, effective, satisfying, learnable, accessible. But I can't do that without acknowledging that industry's been changing in the last couple of years, and my designs with that have also been changing. The biggest thing I see is that everyone's using AV over IP lately. It seems like everyone now makes a product, and the chips that do these things are getting less expensive. The components that go into those are getting less expensive. The equipment itself is getting finally to a point where that's viable for most organizations. So there's a natural tendency to kind of move all this AV stuff to IT, which means I now have a little bit more time not looking at designs where everything is connected to a cloud, but focusing on where users run into problems and making things a little more efficient and satisfying for them by running a couple of quick tests. And so to bring everything back to where we began, we can measure usability to allow us to get the system out of the user's way. And that's only one part that goes into crafting an experience, but I think it happens to go a long way towards that end. So what I'd like, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But what I really like is, and thank you for all sticking around.